Hello everyone, welcome to this video on supplier management. What we're going to be doing is trying to understand the basis of the supplier procurer relationship and understand what the contours of that relationship really are. And that's going to form the basis of trying to develop an approach to actually effectively manage our suppliers and most importantly align the interests of both the supplier and the procurer. So if we start with the basic question of trying to model this relationship, and what we mean by modeling the relationship is try to understand what the structural interests are and what kind of framework we can apply to understand how the relationship forms and develops. We do find that there are quite a few models in common use. So one model that we are going to look at is the Tuckmans Model. So you may have come across this in many other kind of forms or other contexts. This is a model for team formation and for collaboration and cooperation. So in a basic level, you have 5 stages: forming, storming, norming, performing, and then adjourning. So the idea behind this model is to understand that each of these stages is distinct and comes with its own particular set of challenges or benefits. So when the team first forms, you have the necessity of getting to know other individuals and other groups within the team. You're aligning your structural interests in order to seek the success for the task or the goal the team is working towards, and you're establishing roles and responsibilities. This moves on to the storming model, where individuals and groups start testing those roles and responsibilities. They start establishing what they see as their particular role and how they would like that role to be executed, and you have inevitable conflict. Now this can be interpersonal conflict simply from different personality types and different communication types, or it can be structural conflict as well. So differing conceptions and understandings of exactly what individual units of work need to be done and how they're to be carried out and so on, or how collaboration and cooperation is to function within the team. So that inevitable conflict, whether it's interpersonal or structural, then leads on to the third stage, which is norming. So developing norms of behavior. So norms of behavior are unofficial or unwritten rules of behavior that everyone within the group is aware of and adheres to. So that may be interpersonal norms, communication norms, collaboration norms. So any type of norm of behavior which helps the team function together. Once those norms have been established, we move on to the performing stage. This is where, because the team has had its conflict, has developed shared norms of behavior that allows a team to go ahead and actually perform to the maximum possible performance. So high performing teams will move on to the performance stage. And really, because the norms are established, because the conflict has been dealt with, they're able to go ahead and maximize their output or maximize the achievement of whatever goals or objectives they have. And then lastly, the adjourning stage is where the team has achieved its objectives or has completed its term of work, and then adjourns into its individual components again to then typically form again. The problem that we have with Tuckmans, it's used to great effect to understand dynamics, team dynamics and interpersonal dynamics in many cases. It's not always a very good model to actually apply to the relationship between the procurer and supplier. You will see this model in various textbooks, and it is taught as one of the ways we can understand a group of suppliers or procurers coming together for a very specific goal or objective. However, I'm a bit skeptical of the ability of the Tuckmans model to really adequately explain the relationship between the two, because of one major omission, and that is that unlike most teams that exist within an organization where there may be different structural interests, those structural interests often take a backseat to the team objectives and the team interests. This is not the case when you're dealing with most procurers and suppliers. The structural interests of the procurer and the structural interests of the supplier are often very distinct, and they survive throughout the length of the relationship. So we can attempt to align the immediate interests of both the procurer and the supplier during the length of the contract or the procurement activity, but ultimately these are two separate parties, and not only do they have different structural interests, these structural interests are often in conflict with each other. So that presents us with a different type of problem when trying to model this relationship. This is actually really well illustrated by just looking at the interest level of the supplier and engaging with the procurer at different stages of the procurement process. So this is just for illustrative purposes, but is by and large true and backed by a quite a significant body of literature, that the interest of the supplier will increase and remain fairly high throughout the supplier selection process. So when you're specifying your procurement need, you're finding potential sources for that to fulfill that procurement need, going through, say, a tendering process or a different supplier selection process. And then when you're negotiating the terms of the contract, interest remains relatively high. However, during the performance of the contract itself, the interest level of the supplier will dip dramatically and only rise again when the payment terms or the specified performance review terms arise. And this really does point to an indication of where the structural interests are in conflict. So the supplier is obviously interested in most cases in winning the business, in actually winning the contract, and they obviously have an interest in getting paid, in receiving revenue for the performance of the contract. But the long-term interest of the supplier will always arise in achieving payment for the minimum possible outlay. So an efficiently run supplier will allocate resources to each contract in order to extract the revenue from the payment from the payment terms, but to over provision resources for a particular contract, which doesn't result in a proportionally higher payment through either the terms of the contract, performance reviews, bonuses, and so on, then that supplier's interest level is going to be too high to actually achieve an efficient outcome for the supplier. An efficient outcome for the supplier is a minimal amount of resources dedicated towards the contract in order to extract the proportionally maximum amount of revenue from payment. And that's obviously not the long-term structural interest of the supplier. So we do have a fundamental conflict here. So instead of trying to treat the supplier and the procurer as a single entity, as the Tuckman model does, which sees that the immediate objectives, so in this case the objective of achieving the fulfillment of the procurement need, is something which unifies the interests of both the supplier and the procurer. This may well be the case when it comes to an individual project team. It may well even be the case when you're talking about a collaboration between two different organizations in joint ventures and so on. But this isn't necessarily the best way to approach a procurer-supplier relationship. So instead, it may be more useful for us to examine exactly how the structural interests of both the procurer and the supplier result in different views of different levels of power and influence within the relationship. So the first thing we can really do is establish that supplier performance is not primarily motivated by wanting to achieve the abstract objective of the supplier procurement relationship, as in Tuckmans model, but rather the output of the ability of the supplier to perform to requirements, coupled with their motivation. So it's ability multiplied by motivation that will actually produce the supplier performance within any given relationship. So ability obviously is something which can be assessed independently. Motivation is something which needs to be managed by the procurer. So instead of seeing this as a Tuckman type conflictual relationship where you come together, then you storm, you have conflict, you establish norms of behavior, and then you go on to perform as a team. Instead, the procurer can view supplier management as really the establishing of the ability to execute the contract at the start during the supplier selection process, and then an ongoing attempt through various informal, formal, contractual and non-contractual means to maintain a high level of motivation. So suppliers need to want to do well, be able to do well, and want to be seen to do well, in order to really achieve the highest possible performance from the perspective of the procurer. Now, we are mostly talking in the abstract, so we can bring a bit more concrete factors into this. So if you want to understand a supplier-procurer relationship, we really do need to place it within the context of the items or the services being procured. So the nature of the product or service that you're procuring obviously has a big impact on the nature of that relationship. The level of the spend, the criticality of the item, the relative size of the buyer and seller, as well as any external macro environmental factors such as geography, regulations, legal factors, and so on. As well as micro environmental factors such as the actual supply market and the relative bargaining power of different parties. So all of this gives us a bit more of a concrete indication of what kind of supplier-procurer relationship we're dealing with. As well as this, you've got other specific elements in that relationship which will obviously have a big impact. So the type of contract, the length of the contract itself, whether it's a short-term ad hoc or spot procurement process, or whether it's developing a long-term relationship which is of a strategic nature perhaps, the individuals involved, the type of information involved, the openness of the flow of information through the supply chain if it's a supply chain relationship, and various other contractual arrangements will certainly have an impact as well. So what this allows us to do, once we have these details and we're able to place a particular procurer-supplier relationship within a specific context, we can actually look at the various procurement strategies that can be pursued by both the supplier and the procurer. So these strategies reflect the long-term structural interests of either party and help us really model that relationship and see how the procurer or the supplier really see their role or see the dynamic of the relationship itself. So if we start with the procurement strategies from the viewpoint of the procurer, and we have four here. On the left-hand side, on the axes, you'll see supply risk. So supply risk can either be high or low, and that represents the importance or the criticality of the item that's being procured for either the operation or the project. If it's something which has low supply risk, there's multiple providers, it's not something which is going to have a significant impact or delay on the project or the operation if there's any interruptions, and there are other alternatives which can be brought in at relatively short notice. High supply risk typically lacks one or multiple of those elements. So it may be a particularly critical part, a critical component or element for the project or the operation. If it's delayed or doesn't meet specification, then that may have significant time and cost implications for your project plan. There may be a limited number of suppliers who actually have access to the technology, material or components, and therefore the supplier cannot easily be replaced. Or there may be something like regulatory or legal concerns surrounding the item being procured. And that requires a degree of complexity, which again increases the supply risk. So that would be on the left-hand side. On the bottom, we see relative spend, and this is just straightforward. We have low relative spend and high relative spend, and this is relative to the organization, to the procurer. So whether it's a low spend for a big multinational is not going to be low spend for a SME operating in Luton, for example. That is relative to the size of other procurement activities within the organization. So if we start first with low relative spend and low supply risk, we have the usual procurement strategy of treating it as routine procurement. So because the supply risk is low, is not something which you want to spend too many resources monitoring and managing, because the knock-on effects are going to be relatively low as well. And because the spend is relatively low, you don't have much opportunity or ability to minimize costs. So instead we treat it as routine procurement, minimize attention and direct resources elsewhere. If we stay with a low spend, but now we move our supply risk to high, this creates a bottleneck. This means that one item, even though it may be relatively cheap or relatively small in terms of the total cost, the absence of this item has a potential to have significant technical, cost, quality, or time implications for our operational project. So treating this like a bottleneck requires significant resources to monitor that contractual relationship with the supplier, to ensure high performance and make sure that supply isn't interrupted. So that's a particularly that's a sign that resources do need to be allocated in order to keep the supply running for this. If we stick with high supply risk but move to also a high relative spend, this means that the organization is dedicating a lot of cash to acquiring this particular items or services, as well as it being critical for the operational project and facing high risk. So we can identify this as really a critical procurement cycle, and therefore strategic alignment would be a good strategy to follow, where you try and develop a strong relationship with the supplier, a strong long-term relationship with the supplier, in order to both try and control the supply risk and therefore safeguard the project or the operations functioning, as well as to try and control the costs within the contract as well. If we drop from keep our relative spend high, but we move our supply risk down, we'd have really a situation where there is no real need to engage in a long-term strategic partnership or strategic alignment, because the supply risk is low, because the item doesn't have many cost or quality implications or time implications. It can be potentially easily switched to another supplier, and there is the existence of multiple suppliers within a competitive marketplace. We just have a large amount of money being spent on the items itself. So therefore the strategy would be to try and leverage our buying power in this case and minimize spend on the item or items themselves. So we're not looking at strategic alignment with a supplier, we're just looking at cost reduction. So leveraging that relationship, that's a far more conflictual relationship. That's the negotiations, the approach, the monitoring, everything is going to be very different in this case. And the approach is less of a long-term partnership to develop competitive advantage, and more of a relationship aimed at just minimizing the costs rather than looking to build that long-term relationship. So if we turn our attention from the procurer to the supplier, and look at a similar matrix of different strategies, that should again give us an understanding of the structural interests and the structural priorities of suppliers. So at the bottom we have the same relative spend. So, and this is now relative to the supplier. So, is this one of the larger clients the supplier has, or is this a relatively small client in terms of total spend? On the left, now instead of supplier risk, we have attractiveness of business, and that can either be high or low. Attractiveness of business can really refer to all manner of things. Ultimately, it determines whether the supplier really wishes to have this particular client, or whether it's not a particular priority. That's different from relative spend, because attractiveness of business may well take into account things like profile. So if you have a high profile client, then that's obviously a marketing boost and a credibility boost for the supplier. It may be a client in a particular industry that the supplier wishes to enter, and try and establish a foothold or even a monopoly within that particular industry. It may be the client has involvement in long-term projects or long-term developmental efforts that the supplier wants to engage and develop a foothold within that particular larger project. So attractiveness of business can relate to all manner of things, but ultimately it refers to how desirable the client's business is for the supplier outside of just the actual relative spend. So if we start, as we did before, with low relative spend as well as low attractiveness, we have what can be politely, I guess, in some terms, termed a nuisance for the supplier. So because the relative spend is low and the attractiveness of the business that the client brings is low, the supplier won't necessarily turn away the client. But if there are any complications, any disputes, any issues, it may be easier, simpler, and more efficient for the supplier to just drop out of the contract, if contractually possible, or to decline to bid for further business from that particular client or procurer. And this may relate to a number of different things. Attractiveness of business isn't just an absence of something pulling the supplier towards wanting to deal with the procurer. It may deal with the types of businesses. So we can see recently, and I say recently when this video was recorded in the first couple of days of 2021, there's been a significant issue with Pornhub, which is owned by MindGeek, which actually got themselves in the news for a variety of different reasons, none of them particularly positive for Pornhub's image and marketing. And as a result, several major credit card and debit card processors, such as MasterCard and Visa, have launched investigations and suspended Pornhub. So we see there that the relative spend may have been either high or low, but certainly the attractiveness of that business was extremely low. So if you have a client with a controversial, high profile in a negative sense, or otherwise problematic business, then that again would reduce the attractiveness of the business to the supplier, rendering this an effective nuisance and therefore dropping the client, or simply not bidding for further business would be a common strategy to end that relationship. If, on the other hand, we still have relatively low spend but particularly high attractiveness, then the goal for the supplier here is to develop the actual relationship itself. Now, we spoke about how suppliers wish to, in the long term, generally like to spend the minimum amount of resources for the maximum amount of revenue. This is a case where the short-term and medium-term interests in wanting to develop the supplier actually triumph over the desire to minimize resource spend by the supplier. So we'd have much higher performance, more resources dedicated towards this contract in order to try and build up a relationship and therefore increase the relative spend, or to establish a foothold in a particular marketplace, a particular country, a particular industry, whatever's causing the attractiveness of the business to be high for that particular supplier. If we keep the attractiveness high but move the relative spend high as well, then you'd have a core client or a core procurer for that particular supplier. So now we both represent a relatively high amount of business for the supplier, and that is business that the supplier explicitly wants to keep for all of the previously mentioned reasons. So there is going to be, again, a higher degree of resources allocated to this particular client, and more attention paid by the supplier as well. The last strategy or the last situation would be where relative spend is high but attractiveness is low. That means that the supplier would not necessarily mind losing that particular client, or would not necessarily look to develop a long-term relationship with the client, in which case the approach is to exploit that contractual relationship as much as possible, since there is no real long-term interest in maintaining a business relationship. Here you would see the minimum amount of resources needed to actually execute the contract, but extracting the maximum amount of revenue, and that pits the supplier in a directly confrontational relationship with the procurer in most instances.